Hey there, I'm Bex, welcome to my channel. This week I am going to be painting an easy watercolour seascape. I'm using hot pressed watercolour paper, my Cotman watercolours, a ceramic mixing palette. I also have a large brush and two smaller brushes for details. Initially I picked out 5 colours for this painting: Van Dyke Brown, Indian Red, Yellow Ochre, Intense Green and Cerulean Blue. As I was getting into the painting, I realised that I didn't have a dark enough blue, so I also picked out turquoise and used that a little for the sea in the distance. I'm just doing a rough sketch of my reference picture. I'm not being too careful, but I'm trying to mark in the main objects, some large rocks, mountains in the background, and roughly mark in where the shoreline is as well. If you're not comfortable drawing it yourself, you can always trace your reference, or you could even use something like the grid method. Before I start painting, I am just taking a kneaded eraser and gently dabbing it over my sketch. This will lift any excess graphite and stop it muddying the watercolour. For the first wash of paint, I am putting down a little bit of water on the paper. You don't want to use too much and make puddles, but you want there to be enough so that the colours can bleed into each other. I'm using my large brush for this, and I'm also using some kitchen roll to lift any excess pigment if I drop in too much colour. For my second layer, I'm going to start defining more features of the landscape. I'm using the wet on wet technique for this, particularly for distant objects. I find it easier when painting landscapes to work from the background towards the foreground. An important thing to bear in mind when doing this is if you are painting areas that are next to each other or touching each other and you don't want the colours to bleed, you need to make sure that paint that you've already put down is completely dry before moving on. A useful trick for painting landscapes is that generally things that are in the distance will have a slightly blue tone, so I try to make sure that I mix in a little blue with whatever colours I'm using for objects that are far away. Obviously it depends on what you're painting, but for this piece I think it worked quite well. As I'm moving through the painting, I am just starting to build up some more layers, adding a bit more detail to the mountains in the distance. I really wanted the focus of this painting to be the shoreline, so I did try not to add too much detail to the background. To paint the waves crashing on the shoreline, I started by adding some darker areas in a kind of sea foam green colour. I knew that the areas underneath the wave would need to be slightly darker to add contrast. I think I could have pushed this a little more, but I'm quite happy with how it turned out. In order to paint the waves splashing, I use some white gouache. When using white gouache, I like to start off by diluting it quite heavily with water. This means that it's very light and transparent and really just gives you a suggestion that the colour is slightly lighter. You can build this up in layers, and the more layers you add, the more variation you get in the tones. So I was kind of relying on this technique for the waves, and I think it worked out quite well. Just starting with the colours quite diluted and then building up those layers to the really bright white highlights for the splashes. This was a challenge to paint, but it was a lot of fun and I definitely recommend you give it a go. I used some thinned down gouache to create some ripples in the water. I wanted to give the water a little bit of a texture and a reflective look. I mapped out where I wanted the shoreline to be with my white gouache, and once I was happy with the location of everything, I used a mixture of the Indian red and the yellow ochre and added a kind of darker gradient directly underneath the white gouache. To do this, I just wet the paper underneath the area that I wanted the colour to bleed into and then added pigment right along the edge. This let the colour spread out underneath and created a bit of depth and shadow. White gouache can look very opaque when it first goes down, but as it dries it becomes more transparent. This gives you quite a lot of freedom to experiment. If you put down a little too much, you can just add some more water and move it around, or even lift it up with a piece of kitchen roll. I went in with some of the turquoise mixed with the cerulean blue, and I just added that underneath the highlights I had created with white gouache in the water to add a little more depth and make the ocean ripples a bit more pronounced. I wanted to add some texture to the sand, so I mixed some of my Indian red with the yellow ochre. Once I had the right colour, I ran my finger along the edge of the flat brush. This let the watercolour spray onto the page, creating lots of tiny little dots that were perfect for that sand texture. To add some splashes and extra highlights to the water, I just used the same technique that I'd used for the sand with the white gouache. The only difference is I made the gouache quite thick and I used the edge of a ruler as I wanted the droplets to be larger and a little more pronounced. And now for my favourite bit of the painting process, taking off the masking tape. There is something so satisfying about leaving clean lines behind, and although this one wasn't perfect, it was close enough for me. If you made it all the way to the end, please hit that subscribe button, it really helps me out, and let me know what you think in the comments. Catch you later!